In the quiet, dusty town of Westfield, Emily Lawson lived in a small, rundown house that had seen better days. Her 20-year-old frame was always a little too thin, the result of long hours spent doing menial jobs just to keep the lights on. The kitchen table in the corner was cluttered with overdue bills, the numbers on each one glaringly familiar. Rent due, utilities overdue, medical expenses mounting. Emily's hands trembled as she sorted through the stack, knowing that her sick mother, Helen, needed constant care, and the money just wasn't enough. The soft sound of Helen's cough echoed through the house, a harsh reminder of their worsening situation. The older woman's condition was deteriorating. For the last several months, she'd been battling a debilitating lung disease, leaving her bedridden and weak. Emily's heart ached as she glanced over at her mother, who lay in bed, her frail body barely moving, save for the occasional cough that rattled through her chest. Emily had already made many sacrifices for her mother, from working late into the night at a low-paying job in a local diner to picking up odd jobs whenever she could. She was exhausted, but every time she looked at her mother's tired face, she knew that giving up wasn't an option. There was no one else. A sudden knock at the door pulled Emily from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat as she crossed the room to answer it. Standing on the other side was a man she didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, and exuding a confidence that felt foreign in their small, humble home. "I'm Daniel Carter," the man introduced himself, his voice calm and authoritative. "I'm looking for Emily Lawson." Her mouth went dry. This wasn't someone she knew. She had no idea what he wanted. "I'm Emily," she said, her voice uncertain. Daniel's eyes scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the cluttered table and the dim lighting of the modest home. "I've been following your story," he said with a sympathetic smile. "Your mother's illness, the mounting bills. I can help." Emily furrowed her brow. "I don't know who you are or what you're offering, but I'm not interested in charity." Daniel's expression softened. "I'm not here to offer charity, Emily. I have a proposal for you. A business proposition, if you will. Marry me, and in return, I'll secure your family's future. You won't need to worry about bills or your mother's care anymore." Emily's mouth went dry. She stared at him, trying to process his words. Marry him? The words echoed in her mind, but it didn't make sense. How could this stranger offer her a lifeline like this? It seemed too good to be true. He continued, "I have the resources to ensure your mother gets the best medical treatment available, and I'll provide for your brother's education as well. Everything will be taken care of, if you agree." Emily couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope at the thought of a future where her family didn't have to struggle. But then doubt crept in. Was it worth it? Was she willing to trade her freedom for the promise of security? "Think about it," Daniel said, his tone gentle but firm. "I don't expect an answer right away, but this could be the chance you need." As Daniel turned and walked away, Emily stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. She was left with an impossible choice. Could she really marry a man she barely knew to save her family? The next few days were a blur of uncertainty for Emily. She couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's proposal. The idea of marrying a stranger seemed absurd, yet the promise of security for her family, especially her mother, made it hard to dismiss. She knew they were running out of time. The bills kept piling up, and her mother's condition was worsening by the day. Emily had always prided herself on being strong, independent, but now she was faced with a decision that threatened everything she believed in. That night, she sat by her mother's bedside, holding her hand as Helen drifted in and out of sleep. The rhythmic sound of her mother's breathing was interrupted by another deep cough, one that rattled her frail body. Emily's heart twisted. She couldn't keep doing this. She couldn't keep struggling day after day, barely getting by, watching her mother fade away. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do. I've been offered a way out, but I don't know if I can take it." Helen opened her eyes slowly, her weary gaze meeting Emily's. "What do you mean?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. "There's a man," Emily said, hesitating. "His name is Daniel Carter. He's wealthy, powerful. He's offering me a way out. Marry him, and he'll take care of everything. My bills, your treatment, Michael's education. We wouldn't have to worry anymore." Helen's eyes flickered with concern. "And what does he want in return?" Emily swallowed hard. He wants me to marry him. There was a long pause as her mother processed the information. I've always tried to protect you, Emily, Helen said, her voice low. But I know how hard you fought to keep us afloat. If you think this is the best option, you have to do what's right for you. For us. But, Emily protested, I don't want to be someone's pawn. I don't want to give up everything for the sake of security. I know, sweetheart, Helen whispered. But you can't keep carrying all of this on your own. You need to think about the bigger picture. The weight of her mother's words hung heavy in the air. Emily wanted to protest, to say she could handle everything, but she knew her mother was right. The burden had grown too heavy. And if there was even a chance this could give her family a future, how could she refuse? That night, Emily lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The future seemed uncertain, but one thing was clear. She had a choice to make. And if she wanted to save her family, she might have to make the hardest decision of her life. The days that followed were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Emily couldn't stop replaying Daniel's words in her mind. Marrying him would solve all their problems. No more late nights spent stressing over bills, no more endless doctor visits with her mother, no more worry about how they would scrape by. But in return, she'd be giving up her autonomy, her dignity, her choice. The idea of being tied to a man she barely knew, bound by a promise that seemed too good to be true, left her feeling unsettled and unsure. Her neighbors, who had always watched with a mix of curiosity and judgment, whispered behind her back. Emily could feel their eyes on her whenever she stepped outside, the gossip swirling around her like a storm. Some were sympathetic, others skeptical. A few even accused her of taking the easy way out, of selling herself for comfort and security. The whispers were like a constant hum in the background of her already chaotic thoughts. She avoided them whenever she could, focusing only on what lay ahead. At home, her mother's health continued to decline. The coughing fits grew worse each night, and the wheezing that followed sounded like it was stealing Helen's breath away. Emily's heart clenched with every sound. How much longer would she be able to keep up this charade of being okay? How long until the weight of everything broke her completely? One morning, after a particularly sleepless night, Emily sat in the kitchen staring at the table. The bills in front of her, a painful reminder of the truth. She was running out of options. It was only a matter of time before her mother's condition reached a breaking point. Her brother Michael, still in high school, had no way of affording college without help. And Emily had no way of securing a future for herself without giving up something precious. She stood abruptly, pushing the chair back with a screech. Her mind was made up. That evening, she called Daniel. Her fingers trembled as she dialed his number, her stomach twisting in knots. She had never been the type to give up control, but in that moment, she realized there was no way out but forward. "I've made my decision," she said when he picked up, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "I'll marry you." A pause on the other end of the line, then Daniel's voice, smooth and reassuring. "I knew you'd come to the right decision. You'll see, Emily. This is the beginning of a new chapter for all of us." The finality in his words left Emily with a strange mix of relief and dread. She wasn't sure what she had just committed to, but there was no turning back now. The morning of the wedding arrived, gray clouds hanging heavy in the sky, as though the weather too sensed the gravity of the moment. Emily stood in front of the mirror, looking at the woman who stared back at her. A stranger, someone who had no idea what her future held. Her dress was simple, elegant, but it felt like a costume rather than a symbol of joy. Her heart beat in her chest like a caged bird, fluttering with fear, yet tinged with a sense of hope she couldn't fully grasp. "Are you ready?" Michael's voice broke through the stillness. Emily turned to find her younger brother standing in the doorway, his face full of concern, but his eyes filled with an understanding that only siblings could share. He was all she had left in the world, and she had promised to protect him. "I don't know," Emily confessed, her voice breaking. "This doesn't feel real." Michael stepped forward, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Whatever happens, you're not alone, Em. We're in this together. Always." She nodded, the words of reassurance giving her a small measure of comfort. She had to do this. For them. For their family. They left the house in silence, the car ride to the grand estate feeling like a blur. The closer they got to Daniel's mansion, the more Emily felt the weight of the decision she had made. This wasn't just a change of address. It was the start of a new life, one where everything would be different, where everything she had known was about to be left behind. As the gates to the estate loomed ahead, Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had stepped into the unknown, and there was no turning back. The mansion stood before her like a monolith, an imposing structure made of stone and glass, its grandeur intimidating and cold. The iron gates creaked open as the car rolled through, and Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The world she had known, the small house in Westfield, the constant worry over bills and her mother's health, seemed so far away now. She had traded it all for this. The mansion was situated on a sprawling estate in upstate New York, miles from the nearest town. The grounds were meticulously manicured, with hedges trimmed to perfection and fountains that glittered like jewels in the distance. It was beautiful, but in an unnatural way, as if it had been crafted to impress rather than to feel like home. As they drove up the long, winding driveway, Emily couldn't help but feel like an outsider. This wasn't her world. It never had been, and now, somehow, she was supposed to fit into it. The car came to a stop in front of the grand entrance, and the door opened before she could even unbuckle her seatbelt. A tall, elegant woman, dressed in a black and white uniform, stood in the doorway. She greeted Emily with a stiff smile, her eyes scanning Emily's appearance with barely concealed judgment. "Welcome, Mrs. Carter," the woman said, her voice formal and uninviting. "I'll show you to your room." "Thank you," Emily replied, her voice uncertain. The woman, whose name was Margaret, led Emily inside. The marble floors gleamed beneath their feet, and the walls were adorned with paintings that seemed as though they belonged in a museum. The air smelled of fresh flowers and something faintly artificial, as if the house itself was trying too hard to appear perfect. "This is the foyer," Margaret said, gesturing to the grand staircase that led up to the second floor. "Your rooms are upstairs. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Emily nodded, but the words felt hollow. She wasn't sure what she needed, only that she wasn't ready to be here. The stairs creaked under her feet as she followed Margaret up to a modest room on the second floor. It was small in comparison to the rest of the mansion, but it still felt grand, too grand for someone like Emily. Margaret set down Emily's bags and turned to leave. Before she could exit, she paused, turning back with a warning in her eyes. "I advise you not to ask too many questions, Mrs. Carter," she said cryptically, her tone carrying a note of something unspoken. "This house has its own rules." Emily stood still, her heart sinking as the door clicked shut behind her. The air seemed to close in around her, the weight of the mansion's silence pressing down on her chest. She had left behind her small, familiar life and entered a world where she was an outsider. She sat on the edge of the bed, the lavish comfort of the room doing little to ease the knot in her stomach. What had she gotten herself into? And what secrets did this mansion hold? In the days that followed, Emily found herself increasingly alone. The mansion, which had once seemed so full of promise, now felt like a prison. She had spent the first few days unpacking and adjusting to her new surroundings, but as the novelty wore off, she began to realize just how isolated she truly was. William was absent for most of the day, locked away in his study or attending to his business affairs. Even when he was home, their interactions were few and far between. He was polite, distant, and almost entirely focused on his work, barely sparing her a glance unless absolutely necessary. Emily tried to engage him a few times, making small talk over dinner or during the rare moments they were in the same room, but William's responses were always short and disinterested. His conversations felt more like transactional exchanges than attempts at building a connection. He would ask about her day, but never seemed to care about her answers. Instead, his eyes always seemed to wander to the stacks of paperwork on his desk or the phone calls he needed to make. It was as if she were just another fixture in the house, a shadow in the background of his busy life. At night, Emily would lie awake in the vast, sterile bed that now belonged to her. The silence of the mansion pressed down on her, amplifying the loneliness she tried to ignore. Every small noise, the wind outside, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of footsteps in the hallway, seemed to echo louder in the empty space. She missed her mother's presence, the quiet comfort of home, and the feeling of connection that had once been so simple. Here, in this enormous house, everything felt artificial. The wealth, the opulence, the elegance. It all felt so hollow. The house staff was no better. Margaret, the woman who had greeted her upon arrival, was kind enough but never went beyond the minimum. There were other servants, but they were distant and impersonal, moving in and out of the house as if they too were just going through the motions. No one spoke to her much, and when they did, their voices were always laced with formality. There were no friendships here, no sense of camaraderie, just the cold efficiency of people who lived in a world far removed from hers. One evening, after yet another solitary dinner in the massive dining room, Emily found herself wandering the halls, trying to shake off the feeling of suffocating isolation. She found herself drawn to the grand staircase, its marble steps leading up to the second floor. The mansion seemed endless, as if it were built to swallow her whole, and the sense of being lost in its vastness unsettled her. She wandered through the upper hallways, touching the delicate wallpaper as though it could offer her some comfort. But there was nothing. She had no idea where she was going, just following the winding paths, hoping to find something that felt familiar. As she turned a corner, she caught sight of a door at the end of the hallway, half open and leading into what looked like an old library. The room was dimly lit, filled with towering bookshelves and old leather-bound volumes. The air in the room felt heavy, as if it had been sealed off for years. Curiosity piqued. Emily stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the floor. The smell of old books filled her senses, but it wasn't the comforting scent she had expected. Instead, it felt oppressive, as though these walls held secrets she wasn't meant to know. Suddenly, Emily heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, startled, but saw nothing. The hallway outside the library remained empty. She breathed a sigh of relief, though the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She was being foolish, she told herself. There was no reason to be afraid. Yet, deep down, a voice in her head told her something wasn't right in this house. Something was hiding just beneath the surface. The unease Emily had felt in the library lingered long after she returned to her room that night. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the mansion itself was closing in on her, its walls pressing tighter and tighter with each passing day. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just the overwhelming sense of displacement that came with moving into a house so grand and unfamiliar. But every night, as she lay in bed, the feeling persisted, growing stronger. It was as if the mansion had a life of its own, and it was waiting for her to uncover something. One evening, Emily was in the drawing room, leafing through an old magazine she had found on one of the coffee tables, when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Soft at first, but then louder, as if someone was walking just outside her door. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly set the magazine down, rising to investigate. She stepped out into the hallway, but there was no one there. Her pulse raced as she turned down the corridor, glancing left and right. There were no signs of movement, no shadowy figures in the distance. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone. The house, once so imposing, now seemed to breathe with an eerie presence. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the walls seemed to whisper, the way the shadows moved just a little too quickly. She pressed her back against the wall, her breath shallow as she tried to calm herself. She couldn't stay in her room anymore. Emily turned and made her way toward the main staircase, intent on finding William. Maybe he could ease her fears, tell her she was just imagining things. But as she walked down the grand staircase, her eyes caught something. A door she hadn't noticed before, tucked away at the end of the hallway. It was different from the others, more solid, more imposing. It seemed almost deliberately hidden from view, as if it were meant to keep her away. Her curiosity, already piqued by the odd atmosphere of the mansion, got the better of her. She took a few cautious steps toward the door, reaching out to touch the cold, polished handle. It was locked, but she could feel the faint vibration of something on the other side, as if the room beyond were alive. The hairs on her neck stood on end. Before she could even try to open it, the sound of Margaret's voice rang out from the distance. "Mrs. Carter, it's late. You should be resting." Emily jumped back, startled, and quickly composed herself. Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs, her face a mask of concern. "I was just exploring," Emily stammered, feeling foolish. "I thought I heard something." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained calm. "It's an old house. The wind can make strange noises. Come, let me show you to your room." With no other option, Emily reluctantly followed Margaret back to her suite. But as she entered the room, the door closed behind her, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The mansion felt different now, darker, more oppressive. Whatever secret it was hiding, Emily was more determined than ever to uncover it. The days following her unsettling encounter with the locked door were marked by a growing sense of urgency. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the room she'd discovered, about the cold, unwelcoming door that seemed to guard the secrets of the mansion. Despite Margaret's reassurances that it was just the old house settling, something in her gut told her otherwise. She couldn't ignore the feeling that the mansion was hiding something sinister, and that she was meant to uncover it. But it wasn't until that fateful afternoon, when William was away on one of his long business trips, that Emily finally found the courage to investigate further. The house was unusually quiet that day, with only the distant sounds of the wind outside and the rustling of trees in the garden. Margaret had gone out on an errand, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. The stillness of the house gave her the perfect opportunity. She made her way to the second floor, where she had noticed the locked door the previous night. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood in front of it, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on her. She reached out to the door handle, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. For a moment, she hesitated. Was she truly ready to open this door? Was she prepared to face whatever secrets it might hold? In that moment, she remembered her mother, her sick, frail mother, who had sacrificed so much for Emily and her brother. Emily had come to this mansion not just to escape poverty, but to secure a future for her family. The weight of responsibility of the promises she had made pressed on her. She needed to know what kind of man she had married, and if he had a past filled with darkness, she had to uncover it. With a deep breath, she turned the handle. The door creaked open, and Emily stepped inside. The room was cold, despite the warmth of the mansion. It was a small, cramped space, filled with stacks of old books, papers, and large filing cabinets. There were boxes of old photographs, some of them faded and yellowed with age. The shelves were cluttered with personal items, trinkets, keepsakes, and what appeared to be legal documents. But what drew Emily's attention the most was the row of journals lying open on a desk, their pages filled with neat, meticulous handwriting. Her curiosity got the best of her, and she approached the desk. The journals seemed like a personal account of someone's life. But whose? She flipped through the pages, scanning the text for clues. The more she read, the more her stomach churned. There were references to multiple marriages, each one ending in mysterious and often tragic circumstances. The names of the women, his wives, sounded familiar, but it wasn't until she came across a photograph that the truth hit her like a cold slap. There, in the photo, were William and his first wife, smiling for the camera, standing together in front of the mansion. But the thing that caught Emily's attention was the inscription on the back: Martha Carter, missing 6 months. Emily's hand shook as she turned to the next photograph, and then the next. Each one revealed a new wife, each one disappearing without a trace. The pattern was undeniable. William Carter had a history, one of lost women, a trail of unanswered questions that he had carefully concealed from the world. The journals told a grim story about how each wife had slowly grown ill, each death or disappearance shrouded in suspicion. Some of the entries were more cryptic than others, hinting at things that couldn't be said outright, as if the writer feared being overheard. Emily felt her heart race as she pieced together the chilling truth. William's past was a web of lies, manipulations, and deaths, and she was now caught in the middle of it. Suddenly, she heard a sound behind her, a soft thud, followed by the creak of footsteps on the floor. Emily froze, her blood turning to ice. She quickly turned around to see William standing in the doorway, his face a mask of fury. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low and dangerous, like a warning. Emily's mind raced, her body frozen in place as she tried to gather her thoughts. She had been caught, and she knew the consequences would be severe. But in that moment, something within her shifted. She could no longer be the passive woman she had been when she first entered this mansion. She had to fight for herself, for her family, and for the women who had suffered before her. "I'm not just your wife, William," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "I deserve to know the truth." William's face hardened, and he stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. The air seemed to grow colder, thicker, as he moved toward her, his presence overwhelming. "Stay away from my past," he growled. "You don't know what you're dealing with." But Emily stood her ground. "You're not going to scare me anymore. I know what you've done. I know about your wives. You won't get away with it." William's expression shifted, the rage in his eyes flickering briefly before he regained control. He looked at her with a mixture of disdain and something darker, something almost predatory. "You think you can expose me? You think anyone will believe you?" His voice was cold, devoid of emotion. "You're mine now, Emily. Don't forget that." But Emily refused to back down. She had found the truth, and she wasn't going to let him intimidate her into silence. She had no idea what she was up against, but she knew that whatever it took, she would find a way out. The days that followed were marked by an intense sense of fear and tension. William had retreated into his study, no doubt seething with anger over Emily's discovery. She could feel the change in the air, the oppressive silence, the cold atmosphere that had once seemed so comfortable now felt like a suffocating weight on her chest. But Emily knew that she couldn't back down. She had uncovered the truth, and now she had to confront William, not just for herself, but for all the women who had suffered at his hands. She had seen the proof, the photographs, the journals, and she knew that his lies could only protect him for so long. One evening, when the house was quiet and the moon hung low in the sky, Emily made her decision. She had to confront William, face to face, and demand the answers she deserved. She couldn't let him hide behind his wealth and power anymore. She found him in his study, sitting at his desk, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp. He didn't look up as she entered, but Emily could feel the tension radiating from him. She closed the door behind her and walked toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. "William," she said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "We need to talk." He finally looked up at her, his eyes narrowing. "What is it now, Emily?" "I know what you've done," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I know about your past, your wives, everything. You can't hide from it anymore." His expression flickered, and for a moment, Emily saw a flash of something in his eyes, a mixture of anger and something else, something darker. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just come in here and accuse me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Emily shot back, her eyes locking with his. "You're a monster, and I'm not going to let you keep getting away with it." For a moment, they just stared at each other, the air thick with tension. Emily could feel her pulse racing, her body poised for whatever might come next. She knew that this was the moment that would define her future. Would she cower in fear, or would she stand up to the man who had controlled her life for so long? William's lip curled into a sneer, and he took a step toward her. "You think you're strong, don't you? But you're nothing, just a pawn in my game." But Emily stood tall, refusing to back down. She had come too far, and she would not let him win. "You're wrong. You're wrong," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not a pawn. I'm a woman with a voice, and I'm going to make sure you never hurt anyone again." William's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. Emily could see the cracks forming in the facade he had carefully built over the years. And in that moment, she knew that the battle for her freedom was just beginning. The days after her confrontation with William were marked by an unnerving stillness. It felt like the calm before the storm, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. William had retreated into his study, hardly leaving the room except for his late-night meetings, and the mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Emily knew she was running out of time. Every moment she spent in the mansion only made her feel more trapped. The walls, once grand and imposing, now seemed suffocating. She couldn't ignore the truth any longer. William had made it clear that he would stop at nothing to maintain control, to protect the dark secrets of his past. But Emily had also made something clear that night. She wasn't going to let him continue to live in his illusion of power. She had to escape. But how? For the first time, Emily allowed herself to entertain the possibility of freedom. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that it wasn't just about running away. It was about reclaiming her life, her voice. She had seen what William had done to the women before her. She couldn't let him do the same to her. She couldn't let him get away with it. That's when Emily turned to Margaret. Margaret, the housekeeper, had always seemed like a quiet, unassuming woman. She was reserved, almost stoic, but there was something in her eyes, a depth of understanding that Emily had always sensed but never fully acknowledged. It wasn't until the night after her confrontation with William that Emily finally worked up the courage to confide in her. "Margaret," Emily whispered, her voice tense with the weight of what she was about to say. "I need your help." Margaret, who had been dusting the furniture in the hallway, froze at the sound of Emily's voice. She turned slowly, her face inscrutable, but her eyes held a knowing look. Emily could see that Margaret had sensed something was wrong for a long time. She had lived in the mansion long enough to see the cracks forming beneath its polished surface. "What's going on, Emily?" Margaret asked, her voice low and measured. Emily glanced around to make sure no one was listening. The mansion was vast, and it was easy to feel isolated, but she had learned to never be too careful. William had eyes everywhere, it seemed, always watching. But she couldn't wait any longer. "William? I know about his past," Emily whispered urgently. "I know what he's done to his wives. I know he's hiding something. I need to leave, Margaret. I can't stay here any longer." Margaret's expression softened. She stepped closer to Emily, lowering her voice. "I've known for a long time, dear. I've seen things, heard things, but I never had the courage to speak out. I've seen women come and go from this house, always disappearing without a trace, and I've always wondered if they were part of something darker. But now that you know, I think it's time we do something about it." Emily felt a surge of relief flood through her. She wasn't alone. Margaret had seen the truth too, and now they had a plan. "We need to act quickly," Emily said, her voice resolute. "He won't let me go without a fight. And if he catches us, He won't," Margaret interrupted. "We've been living in his world for too long, but he's grown complacent. I know his schedule. I know where he goes, who he meets with. We can slip away unnoticed." The plan began to take shape that night, as Emily and Margaret sat in the kitchen, whispering together. The housekeeper had always been observant, had always known the ins and outs of the mansion, its passages, its hidden corners. Over the years, she had learned all the places that were easy to escape from, places where William wouldn't look. Margaret's experience and knowledge were invaluable. She knew when William would be occupied with his meetings and when the guards would be at their least attentive. Emily would need to move quickly, quietly, and she would have to trust that everything would fall into place. For the next few days, Emily carefully observed William's routines. She noted when he was home and when he was gone, when the staff was most likely to be distracted. Every little detail mattered, and each time Emily looked at the clock, she felt her pulse quicken. Time was not on her side. The night of her escape finally arrived. It was a night like any other, the mansion wrapped in an eerie silence. William had left for one of his mysterious meetings, just as Margaret had predicted. The staff was busy, going about their chores, unaware of the plot that was about to unfold. Emily stood in the hallway, her heart hammering in her chest. The plan had been set in motion. She was ready. Margaret had gone ahead to create a diversion. She would signal to Emily when the guards were distracted. All Emily had to do was get to the basement and find the hidden passageway that would lead her out of the mansion. It was a dangerous route, but it was the only one that would give her a chance at freedom. As the minutes ticked by, Emily grew more nervous. But she knew she couldn't back out now. She couldn't turn back. This was her only shot. She crept down the hall, her footsteps silent on the marble floors. The mansion was dark, but she knew the way. The passage was hidden behind a stack of old crates in the basement, a secret that only a few people knew about. Emily had found it by accident weeks ago, but she hadn't dared to go down it until now. Margaret's signal came, a flicker of light in the hallway, just as planned. Emily moved quickly, almost too quickly. She reached the basement door and pushed it open. The smell of dust and dampness hit her, but there was no time to hesitate. She moved through the basement, her hand trembling as she reached for the crates. With a quiet grunt, she moved them aside, revealing the narrow passageway hidden behind them. She didn't look back as she stepped into the darkness, feeling her way along the walls. The passage was cramped, cold, and narrow, but it felt like freedom. But as Emily began to make her way through the tunnel, she heard it, a faint sound in the distance, growing louder. Footsteps. Voices. She knew instantly that they had realized she was gone. The sound of footsteps grew closer, and Emily's heart raced. She quickened her pace, the tunnel narrowing with each step. The walls pressed in on her, the air growing thick and stifling. Her only focus was the exit, the one chance she had to escape this nightmare. But she couldn't shake the feeling that William's men were close, that they were hot on her trail. She heard shouting now, voices calling out, echoing through the mansion above. She knew they were searching for her. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to hurry, to push herself harder, faster. She stumbled, but regained her balance, refusing to stop. She had no choice but to keep moving, to keep running. At last she saw it, a sliver of light at the end of the tunnel. The exit was just ahead, a small door leading to the outside world. She could almost taste freedom, feel it in her bones. But before she could reach it, she heard a man's voice, loud and urgent. "Stop her! Don't let her get away!" Emily's heart skipped a beat. They were close, too close. She had no more time. With everything she had left, she pushed herself forward, her legs burning, her breath ragged. She reached the door, her fingers fumbling as she tried to turn the handle. It was locked. She heard the sound of heavy footsteps behind her. Desperation surged through her. She had to get out. With a final, frantic twist of the handle, the door gave way. She pushed it open, emerging into the night air. The cool wind hit her face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. But her freedom was short-lived. As Emily stepped onto the grass, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her, closer, faster. They were coming. The chase had begun. The night air was sharp against Emily's skin as she fled into the darkened woods. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. But there was no time to slow down, no time to think. The distant sound of footsteps was growing louder, and she knew they were gaining on her. She couldn't let herself be caught, not now, not after everything she had been through to get this far. She had to get away. She pushed forward, her legs burning with the effort, branches and thorns tearing at her skin. Every step felt like it might be her last, but she couldn't stop. The mansion, with its secrets, its darkness, was behind her, but its grip still held tight. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, the forest thick with shadows, but Emily knew this land. She had wandered these woods countless times before, though never in a panic like this. She cursed herself for not planning the escape better, for not having a clear destination in mind. But she had to rely on instinct now, and the instinct of survival was stronger than anything else. Her mind raced. The mansion was far behind her now, but she had no idea where she was heading. She only knew that she had to keep moving, had to keep putting distance between herself and the men who were chasing her. Her breaths were coming in shallow, desperate gasps, and her muscles screamed for rest, but there was no time for weakness. Not now. Not when freedom was so close. The sound of footsteps was too close. Emily risked a glance over her shoulder, her chest tightening with dread. The moonlight broke through the trees, casting a pale light over the path behind her. In the distance, she saw them. 3 men, their figures outlined by the soft glow of the moon, closing in on her. Their eyes gleamed with purpose, and Emily's heart sank. She was almost out of the woods, almost in the clear. But if they caught her now... She pushed harder, the forest ahead seeming to stretch into infinity. Then, in the distance, something changed. A flash of light, headlights. Someone was there. She stumbled to a stop, her breath hitching in her throat. It was a car, speeding toward her. The sound of the engine roared in her ears, and her pulse quickened. The men chasing her were close now, and if they saw the car, they would catch up to her for sure. "Help!" Emily screamed, her voice barely more than a whisper in the wind. But it was enough. The car screeched to a halt. The headlights illuminated the path before her, blinding her momentarily. Then the door swung open, and a figure stepped out. It was a man. Tall, dark-haired, his eyes narrowed with urgency as he took in her wild, panicked appearance. "Get in!" he shouted, his voice commanding. "Hurry!" Without thinking, Emily ran to the car, throwing herself into the passenger seat. The door slammed shut behind her, and the car lurched forward just as the men chasing her broke through the trees. The headlights flashed across their faces, but it was too late. They were too far behind now. The car sped away, tires screeching on the gravel road as Emily's heart raced in her chest. The man in the driver's seat didn't say a word, but his eyes flicked to her from time to time, concern evident in his expression. Emily's breath finally began to slow, her body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. She slumped back into the seat, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Are you okay?" The man asked after a few moments, his voice softer now. "What happened?" Emily swallowed, still too shaken to form a coherent sentence. But her voice finally broke through, raw and desperate. I need to get away. I don't know where to go. They'll find me. He'll find me." The man looked at her, his eyes narrowing with something like recognition. "William Carter," he muttered to himself, his jaw tightening. "I've been tracking him for years." Emily blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Who are you?" The man's expression softened. He was looking at her now with something that could only be described as sympathy. "I'm James Knight," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm a journalist. I've been investigating William Carter and his past for years. I've been trying to bring him down." Emily's heart skipped a beat. You're trying to take him down?" she asked, a flicker of hope rising in her chest. James nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I've got evidence, proof of his crimes, but it's all been too dangerous to expose. That's why I've been tracking him, trying to get the right moment. You, Emily, you're that moment. The things you know, what you've seen, it's the key to finally taking him down." The reality of what James was saying hit her like a ton of bricks. She had known that William was dangerous, but to hear someone else confirm it, to hear that this had been a long-standing battle for justice, it was overwhelming. I didn't know what to do," Emily whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "I just had to get out." "You did the right thing," James said gently, glancing over at her. "Now we just need to get that evidence into the right hands. We're not done yet, but you're safe for now, and that's what matters." As the car raced down the darkened road, Emily let herself relax for the first time in what felt like forever. She wasn't alone anymore, and she wasn't powerless. The weeks that followed were a blur of media frenzy and legal battles. William Carter's world, once towering and invincible, crumbled under the weight of the evidence Emily and James had uncovered. His past, his dark secrets, were exposed for the world to see. The victims of his cruelty came forward, their voices rising to demand justice. Emily's testimony was crucial, and the truth she held in her hands, captured in documents, photos, and hidden files, was undeniable. William Carter was arrested, his empire collapsing around him. His power, once so immense, was gone, and Emily was left standing in the light of truth. But the journey wasn't easy. Emily faced threats, intimidation, and harassment from those still loyal to William. But she stood firm, supported by James, who had proven to be not just an ally, but a friend. As time passed, Emily's strength grew. She found solace in knowing that her escape wasn't just for her. It was for every woman who had ever been silenced by fear, by power. Her bravery had sparked a ripple of change that would echo through the lives of countless others. With the media spotlight on her, Emily decided to use her newfound platform for good. She opened a community center, New Beginnings, dedicated to helping women in crisis. It was a place of healing, of hope, where survivors could find support and resources to rebuild their lives. Emily's bond with James deepened over time, and what had started as a partnership in pursuit of justice slowly grew into something more. Months of working side by side had forged a connection that neither could deny. James, with his quiet strength and unwavering determination, had been by her side through it all. One evening, after a long day at the community center, James took Emily's hand. Emily, he said softly, looking into her eyes, I've watched you fight for your freedom, for your future, and for others. I've seen you overcome everything that's been thrown at you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. The words struck her like a lightning bolt. She had never imagined that love would find her again after everything she had been through. But here it was, in the form of James, someone who had seen her, truly seen her, and who had never given up on her. Yes, Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, I'll marry you. In that moment, with the weight of the past behind them, they both knew that they had a future, one full of hope, healing, and new beginnings. As Emily stood before the women who had found refuge in her center, she spoke to them, her voice steady and sure. Your past doesn't define you. It's what you do now, today, that matters. Together, we can build a new life. And in that moment, Emily knew she had found the strength to face the future, no matter what it held. As Emily stood at the threshold of a new chapter in her life, she looked back at the journey that had brought her here, at the darkness she had escaped, and the light she had embraced. The road had been long, filled with pain, fear, and uncertainty, but it had also been a path of transformation, of reclaiming her voice, her power, and her future. With James by her side, and the women she had helped behind her, Emily knew that the journey wasn't just about survival. It was about rebuilding, about finding strength in the face of adversity, and about embracing the hope of new beginnings. In a world where darkness often threatens to silence the light, Emily had learned that even the smallest spark could ignite a fire of change. And as she looked forward to the future, she knew one thing for certain. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage, resilience, and the unwavering belief that her story was just beginning. The past no longer held her captive. She was free. And this time, the future was hers to shape. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to Emily's journey and watch the video. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed the story and felt inspired by Emily's courage and resilience, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others. Your engagement helps us continue creating meaningful content, and we appreciate every single one of you. Stay tuned for more stories that inspire, empower, and ignite change. Until next time, take care and keep believing in new beginnings.